The set of Family Feud was buzzing with energy that afternoon. The audience was full, the lights were bright. Two families sat across from each other, eager to answer questions and win money. Steve Harvey was in his element, making people laugh, asking questions with his characteristic timing and humor. It was a normal episode, or so it seemed. A woman named Sarah Chen was standing at the podium for her family. She was in her late 40s, with a nervous energy about her. She'd been answering Family Feud questions for the last few minutes, trying to help her family win points. Steve had been joking with her, keeping the mood light and fun. But Steve noticed something. When Sarah reached into her purse to pull out her notes, he caught a glimpse of her wallet. More specifically, he caught a glimpse of what was in her wallet. There were $4 bills, just 4, and they seemed to be all she had. Steve's expression changed in that moment. He'd seen poverty before. He'd grown up poor himself. He knew what it looked like when someone had almost nothing left. The way Sarah's wallet was held so carefully, like those $4 were precious beyond measure, told him everything. He knew that look because he'd worn it before. Steve paused the game momentarily. He looked at Sarah directly. "How much money do you have right now?" Steve asked quietly. The question wasn't accusatory. It wasn't judging. It was just a direct, simple question asked with genuine concern. Sarah looked confused by the sudden shift in tone. The audience went silent. "What?" she asked. "In your wallet," Steve said. "How much money do you have?" "I saw $4 bills." The studio went completely quiet. Sarah's face flushed red. She was embarrassed. She didn't want to answer. She didn't want the entire audience and everyone watching at home to know about her financial situation. But Steve was waiting for an answer, and his expression was one of genuine care, not judgment. "Just $4, Sarah said quietly. There was an audible gasp from the audience. Steve's face changed. He set down his cards. "That's all you have?" he asked. Sarah nodded, tears starting to form in her eyes. She'd been trying so hard to hold it together, to just have fun on this game show, to pretend everything was fine. But the question broke something open inside her. "Yes," she whispered. Steve stood up from his desk. He walked around it and approached Sarah. He took her hand gently. "Tell me what's going on," he said, and Sarah broke down. The story came pouring out. She'd lost her job 8 months ago when the company she worked for downsized. She'd been looking for work, but at her age, employers seemed to prefer younger employees. Her savings had run out 3 months ago. She'd been living in her car for the last 2 weeks. The only reason she was here on Family Feud was because her sister had entered her into the lottery drawing months ago, not knowing what Sarah's situation would become. She was wearing her best clothes that day. She'd borrowed makeup from her sister. She'd done everything she could to look put together, to look successful, to hide the fact that she was actually desperate. She had $4 left. That was her entire net worth. She was sleeping in her car every night, and she had $4 to her name. Steve's eyes filled with tears as she spoke. The entire studio was crying. The camera operators were wiping their eyes. Audience members were openly weeping. This wasn't reality television drama. This was a real human being in actual crisis, and everyone watching understood the gravity of it. Steve didn't let go of her hand. He listened to her entire story. He learned that she had been a nurse for 22 years before the downsizing. She'd taken care of people her entire adult life. She'd saved lives. She'd worked through the pandemic, risking her own health to care for COVID patients. And now she couldn't save herself. She had $4. When Sarah finished telling her story, Steve did something that would define this moment forever. He reached into his wallet. He pulled out his own money. He didn't pull out a check. He didn't make promises. He pulled out real money and he put it into her hands. But it wasn't just cash. Steve had a specific amount in mind. He looked at Sarah and he said, "I'm going to start this, but I'm not going to be alone." He put $5,000 in Sarah's hands. The audience erupted. People were screaming. People were crying harder now. Sarah collapsed into Steve's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. This woman who'd been trying so hard to hold it together just broke down completely. The embrace lasted a long time. Steve held her like a father would hold a daughter. He held her like he understood exactly what she was going through, because he did. But Steve wasn't done. He looked at the audience. "How many of you will help this woman?" he asked. Every single hand went up. People were standing up, pulling out their wallets. People were grabbing phones to get checkbooks. The camera panned across faces of people openly crying. People moved to action by what they were witnessing. A businessman in the front row stood up and said, "I'll donate $10,000. A young woman in the middle section stood up and said, "I'm a nurse too. I'll donate $5,000. A retired teacher stood and said, "Sarah taught me in high school. I'll donate $3,000. One by one, people stood up and committed money. Some pledged thousands, some pledged hundreds, some pledged whatever they had in their wallets that day. Within 10 minutes, over $100,000 had been pledged to Sarah Chen by audience members alone. The spontaneous fundraising continued as more people stood and made commitments, but it didn't stop there. Steve addressed the camera. He looked directly at the viewers at home. His face showed the emotional weight of what was happening. If you're watching this right now and you want to help Sarah Chen, we're setting up a fund. Sarah was a nurse. She saved lives. She cared for people during a pandemic when most of us stayed safe at home. Now it's our turn to save hers. Now it's our turn to show her that she's valued, that she's seen, that she matters. The television station set up a hotline number at the bottom of the screen. The phone line started ringing immediately. Email addresses were provided. A GoFundMe was created, and it exploded within hours. Donations started flooding in from across the country. People were donating from their homes, from their cars, from their workplaces. Teachers donated. Healthcare workers donated. Parents donated. By the time the episode aired a week later, over $500,000 had been donated to Sarah's fund. News outlets picked up the story. Major media outlets began covering the moment. It was trending on every social media platform. That $4 in Sarah's wallet had triggered something in the American consciousness. People saw themselves in Sarah. People saw their own mothers, their own sisters, their own friends who were just one bad break away from the same situation. The story behind those $4 became clear through interviews and social media. Sarah had been a dedicated nurse for more than 2 decades. She'd raised 2 children as a single mother after her husband passed away when the kids were young. She'd put both kids through college. She'd been the reliable one, the strong one, the one everyone counted on. But when the company downsized, she became expendable. And when your age worked against you in the job market, finding new employment became impossible. She'd applied for jobs everywhere. Retail stores wouldn't hire her because they wanted younger people. Healthcare facilities preferred newer graduates. She'd even tried fast food restaurants, but was told she was overqualified. The invisible wall of ageism had trapped her completely. Her unemployment benefits ran out. Her savings disappeared. Within months, she was living in her car. The $4 represented what was left. She'd been spending them $1 at a time on gas or small food items to survive. Those $4 were her lifeline until she could figure out what to do next. And then she came to Family Feud, wearing borrowed clothes and borrowed makeup, trying to hide her desperation. But Steve Harvey saw her. He saw the $4. He saw the person. And he acted. Sarah Chen's story didn't end with money. It allowed her to get back on her feet. But what was more important was that she was seen. After 8 months of trying to hide her situation, after 2 weeks of sleeping in her car, after months of feeling invisible and desperate, Sarah was suddenly surrounded by hundreds of thousands of people who cared about her welfare. She got a job within a month, not just any job, but a nursing position at a prestigious hospital whose CEO had watched the Family Feud episode and personally reached out to her. The CEO was moved by her story and wanted to employ someone with her experience and dedication. Sarah was able to get an apartment. She was able to buy a car. She was able to rebuild her life. But the impact of that moment extended far beyond Sarah Chen. The episode sparked a national conversation about poverty in America. It sparked discussions about ageism in hiring practices and how companies were failing their longtime employees. It sparked donations to homeless shelters and job training programs across the country. Churches began discussing what they could do to help people in situations like Sarah's. Community organizations began creating initiatives to help people experiencing homelessness and job loss. The Family Feud episode that started with $4 became the most watched episode in the show's history. It was shared millions of times on social media. It was discussed in schools and universities. It was the subject of think pieces and academic papers about the power of television to create social change and the role of individual compassion in society. Steve Harvey's actions that day weren't about television. They weren't about ratings or going viral or creating a viral moment. When Steve saw those $4, he responded from a place of genuine human compassion. He saw someone in need, and he acted. He used his platform, yes, but more importantly, he used his humanity. He used his own experience of poverty to recognize Sarah's pain. Years later, Sarah Chen appeared on Family Feud again. This time she came as a successful nurse, working full-time, living in a home she'd purchased with money she'd earned, helping other people in crisis through volunteer work. She brought Steve a gift. It was a picture of those $4 bills, preserved and framed, but underneath the frame, she'd written a message. $4 became 500,000, which became a second life. But more than that, it meant someone cared. It meant I was seen. Thank you for seeing me. Steve cried when he opened the gift. He hugged Sarah again. The audience cried with them. This was a moment of full circle, of a life that had been saved, of someone who had been on the absolute bottom, now able to help others climb out of the same hole. The moment when Steve Harvey noticed $4 in a contestant's wallet became one of the most powerful moments in television history. It wasn't scripted. It wasn't planned. It was just one human being seeing another human being in crisis and responding with unconditional compassion. It was proof that sometimes the smallest details, $4, can trigger the biggest changes. This is the story of how one moment of genuine human connection changed a life. This is the story of how visibility, compassion, and community action can save someone from the depths of despair. This is the story of Sarah Chen and the $4 that sparked a national movement toward helping people in crisis. It reminds us all that poverty is closer than we think. It reminds us that people who are struggling are still people we know and love. It reminds us that one person's willingness to see, to care, and to act can create waves of change that impact thousands of other people. It reminds us that sometimes the most powerful moments on television have nothing to do with the script and everything to do with the humanity of the people involved. When Steve Harvey noticed those $4, he didn't know the full depth of Sarah's story yet. He would learn it in the coming minutes as she broke down and shared everything with him on live television in front of an audience of 200 people and millions watching at home. But in that first moment, when he saw the wallet, Steve was operating on intuition and recognition. He recognized the look of someone who was barely surviving. He recognized the careful way the wallet was held, like it contained something infinitely precious. He recognized it because he'd been there before. Steve Harvey had grown up in poverty. His father was abusive. His mother worked hard to keep the family together. Steve had experienced homelessness in his 20s. He'd lived in his car. He'd worked as a door-to-door vacuum salesman and insurance salesman, and a carpet cleaner, struggling to make ends meet. He'd performed comedy in small clubs for minimal pay, sleeping in his car between shows. He knew what it felt like to have $4 and see them as the difference between survival and complete collapse. That lived experience gave Steve something that many people with wealth don't have: empathy, born from actual understanding. He wasn't looking at Sarah with pity. He was looking at her with recognition. He was seeing himself in a younger female version, facing the same impossible situation that he'd once faced. When Sarah began telling her story, the details emerged that made her situation even more heartbreaking. She had 2 adult children. Her daughter was a teacher. Her son was working as a social worker. She'd sacrificed everything to raise them, to send them to college, to give them opportunities that she never had. They'd turned out to be good people, productive people, people who cared about others. She'd done everything right as a parent, but the system had failed her when she most needed help. The nursing shortage meant that hospitals desperately needed experienced nurses, yet Sarah couldn't get hired because of her age. She was 53 years old and facing invisible discrimination in every job market. She'd tried to hide her age on applications. She'd dyed her hair. She'd worn trendy clothes to interviews. Nothing worked. She was trapped by a system that valued youth over experience, that valued new graduates over people with 2 decades of proven expertise. Her children didn't know the full extent of her situation. She'd hidden it from them because she was their mother, and mothers protect their children, not the other way around. She told them she was taking a sabbatical, that she was figuring things out. She hadn't told them she was living in her car. She hadn't told them that her sabbatical meant she had $4 to her name. When she came to Family Feud, she'd borrowed $200 from a coworker from her last nursing job. She'd used that money to buy a new outfit, get her hair done, and pay for gas to drive to the Family Feud studio. She was investing her last resources in a lottery chance to win money on a game show, because that was her only remaining option. There were no more job applications to send. There were no more savings to draw from. There was only this: a game show, $4, and hope that something would change. As Sarah told this story to Steve Harvey on live television, the gravity of the moment became heavier. This wasn't a sob story manufactured for television drama. This was a real human being describing real desperation. This was a woman who'd given her entire adult life to caring for other people, now facing a system that had completely abandoned her. The audience was silent during her entire story. Tears streamed down faces. The camera operators were visibly affected. The producers in the control room were watching something that transcended entertainment. This was television becoming a platform for something real and important. When Steve committed his $5,000, when he announced that he wouldn't be alone in helping, when he invited the audience to join him, that's when the moment transformed from personal to collective. It became about more than Sarah. It became about what it meant to see someone. It became about the power of a community recognizing one of its own in crisis and responding. The pledges that came were remarkable. A woman who was a nurse supervisor stood up and pledged $10,000, saying that Sarah represented everything she valued in nursing, and she refused to let someone like her suffer. A businessman who'd built his career in healthcare said he'd match the first $50,000 raised. A retired teacher said that Sarah's dedication reminded her of why she'd gone into teaching, to make a difference. And she wanted to make a difference in Sarah's life. One young person in the audience said they'd donate $1,000 from their savings because they'd just watched their own parent lose their job, and they understood the fear. Another person said they'd been homeless, and they wanted to help someone else climb out of that situation. The pledges weren't just about money. They were about community. They were about saying, "We see you, we value you. We're not going to let you fall through the cracks alone." They were about collective responsibility for someone who'd given her life to helping others. By the time the onset fundraising ended that day, over $200,000 had been committed. The hotline that was set up went live that evening, and by the next morning, another $300,000 had come in. The momentum continued for weeks as the story spread across the country and then across the world. News outlets that had been dominated by negative stories suddenly had a story of human goodness. It was what people needed to see. In a time of division, this was something that united people. In a time of cynicism, this was something that restored faith in human nature. Sarah's story inspired similar moments on other television shows. Hosts became more aware of the real struggles in their audiences. Producers started thinking about how entertainment could also become a platform for compassion. The Family Feud moment became a case study in how attention, real, genuine human attention, could create change. For Sarah specifically, the money allowed her to rebuild. But the psychological impact was equally important. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was seen. She was valued. She mattered. Those $4 had become a signal to the world that a human being was drowning, and the world had responded. When she started her new job as a nurse at the prestigious hospital, she approached her work with renewed purpose. She'd been saved by the compassion of strangers. Now, she wanted to pass that compassion forward. She volunteered her off hours to work with homeless patients and uninsured patients who came to the hospital. She became an advocate for older workers trying